The last part of the workshop is just going to be going over the general protocol that we use for analyzing baleen whale species and determining whether they're detected, possibly detected, or not detected. And so this is essentially how we analyze pitch track data. We have 4 main criteria that we look at. The first is amplitude, so how loud or quiet the pitch track is. So often if we see a lot of really dark blue or light blue pitch tracks and they look like kind of, I call them like clusters of yarn, like tangled yarn, a lot of times that's background noise. Versus if you have like a nice cleanly drawn, like if somebody took a pencil and drew like a nice line, something that's defined, that's more likely to be a biological noise. And we'll look at a lot of examples of this as well. So amplitude is the one that we look at. The shape of the pitch track, so we have kind of like poor shape versus good shape. Poor shape, especially if it's fainter, they might not be pitch tracked as cleanly. So you might get more of kind of a jagged pitch track, which we'll look at examples of all of this. Versus sometimes smoother pitch tracks, especially louder sounds, typically get pitch tracked more cleanly that way. So amplitude, shape, the isolation or context of the sound. So is it surrounded by a bunch of clustered noise, or what we call spurious pitch tracks, which are just little blips, a lot of little random pitch tracks that are typically just noise. If it's in with a bunch of that, it could be just noise rather than a biological call. Also looking at what other animals are around, usually humpbacks, right? So if there's a humpback singing or doing social sounds, that's also something to take into consideration, especially if you're looking at right whales or sei whales. And then classification, not so much for humpbacks, but for our other 3 species that we look at, sei whale, right whale, and fin whale, the classifications are part of our analysis protocol because the classifier is pretty dependable. So those are the 4 criteria that we look at. Starting with right whales here, these tables, we have a table like this. They're in different colors for each species. These are our quick guides that are very easy to kind of go in and glance. I usually advise analysts to just like take screenshots of these quick guides and just have all 4 readily accessible because they're nice to just check yourself to make sure the way you're analyzing is fitting into the protocol. So you would read this as to score a 15-minute period of pitch track data as detected for North Atlantic right whale. Yes, you need at least some classified right whale calls, up calls specifically. Right whales are pretty sporadic. You might get a few calls here, and then 10 minutes later you get 1 call. They don't usually have a pattern. They can create up call bouts, but those are more rare. Usually they're just random up calls. Context, if humpbacks are present, just exercise caution, right? So if they look like they're very patterned, there are other call types around those calls, it could very likely be a humpback upcalling rather than right whale. So just be careful of that. And then this last column here tells you what specifically we need as far as the classifications to say detected. So you would read this as we need at least 3 decent quality upcall pitch tracks in the 15-minute period, and at least 1 of those needs to be classified by the detector or by the classifier. So you need at least 3 upcalls. 1 must be classified for detected. For possibly detected, you may or may not need classifications depending on this. Again, you don't need a pattern. They're going to be sporadic. Exercise caution if humpbacks are there. And then for possibly detected, you might have like 1 classified call or 2 classified calls. But since you don't have 3 and 1 classified, we would score that. We would downgrade that to possibly detected. Or if you have a bunch of unclassified calls and no classifications at all within a 15-minute period, you would also score that as possibly detected. Don't worry, we're going to look at pictures. It's going to be more fun. And then not detected, of course, is if you don't see much at all. This is great. These little blurbs here are just a summary of the type of upcall or the type of call that we look for. We have this summarized for each species. So our right whale upcalls typically occur in the 50 to 300 hertz range, and those are they're their contact call. They're the most identifiable right whale call that we use. And as far as the reasoning behind the classifications, like this is a fairly conservative protocol, and we keep it that way because we can't listen in real time. Like we're looking at the pitch track data, which is, for a trained analyst, it can be very informative, but we don't want to totally be making up stories about the data. So we really want to be careful about what we score as detected. So down here, this is an example of a period that we could score as detected. So these are just screenshots from real data. So this is like if you had this example within a 15-minute chunk, right? And if this was like the only kind of real right whale evidence that you could see, right? We have 3 pretty good up calls. This one I would say is not great quality, right? It's a little bit jagged, it's pretty faint, has a general up call shape. So we're looking at amplitude, we're looking at shape. Context is a little bit questionable. There's some low frequency noise here, which we can tell it's a lot of blue, like dark blue, light blue, kind of clustered. Looks kind of messy, which is often indicative of noise. But then we have these two, which are the best evidence here, these 2 classified up calls. So going back up to our protocol, we have 3 up calls, and at least 1 must be classified. In this case, we have 2. So this one we would score as detected. If we scroll down here, this is the fun one because it's much prettier. We have a lot of really loud up calls. So this is like a period where you would go in and you would look at this and you're like, oh yeah, there's a right whale there. So nice isolation, right? Not a lot of other noise, no obvious other humpback call types, and we'll see some examples of humpbacks. We also have a lot of examples. I have an example spreadsheet of humpback song examples if you get into this and you want to kind of educate yourself on what the patterns can look like, because it can be hugely helpful when you're starting out as a new analyst with pitch track data to be familiar with the patterns. But here we see a bunch of classifications, and it doesn't matter for the real-time analysis what the number is. So as long as it's 5 through 8, it's a right whale call type. We just consider it to be a right whale. We don't have to. I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, that's a 7, oh, that's a 6. It doesn't matter as long as it's right whale. So most of these I would say are high quality pitch track. They're nice defined lines. A lot of them are quite loud and classified, and we have definitely more than 3. Possibly detected. So if this was all we had to go off of here, we just have 1 faint classified up call. So that would fit into our either 1 or 2 classified, or our 1 or 2 classified up calls for our possibly detected criteria. Same thing here. Noise, blue clusters. Eventually you kind of filter those out visually. But this is fairly well isolated. It's a little bit short, a little bit faint, but the classification, this is where the classification does help kind of draw it out. Like we know that has been matched against our call library as a right whale. And then not detected, of course. This little bad pitch track. Not detected. So you could, and the notes box is great at the bottom of each pitch track period. You can put in as many notes as you want. Okay, yes.
So it's important to know that our analysts are not just taking the place of a computer, meaning I could just have the system count up the number of classified calls and non-classified calls and like come up with some algorithm. The analyst is using their experience to make a judgment. So analysts sometimes fall into the trap of like, there's this many classified calls, so it must be this, but we want the human to actually be a human and not just use this as if it were a complete prescription of what to do. So
yeah, and I think that's
we want the analyst to use their good judgment.
Yeah, and the 4 main criteria are like, it helps with that, because that helps with your intuition of like, oh, it's faint and it's in with a bunch of other noise, like probably not a reliable pitch track, that kind of a thing. When we do the 2-day training, you actually go through practice. So we do have like 3 practice days of analysis that we go through, and then we discuss it as a group, and it can be eye-opening, because like you might look at this and you're like, oh yeah, there's a right whale there, and of course Mark assigns us like the hardest days that are the most complicated scenarios, right? And so it gets really intricate sometimes with what you have to deal with in the real data, or quite boring. Yes,
When you bring a new person on, do you do some overlap with an experienced person to start?
That's the best way. So new people go through the training with Julianne, but it's great if they get folded into a group that's been doing it for a while. So,
Yeah.
for instance, University of New Brunswick is taking on a new analyst, but she's coming into a group where 2 or 3 of them have been doing this for years, and that's the best way because then they can talk back and forth.
Yeah, they can try and follow this, and then when they get into extra complicated stuff, they have someone to immediately go talk to. Yeah.
And then they have Julianne and I as a backstop.
Well, and you created the R4W
Oh, yeah.
Wales analysts email listserv. So anybody who does real-time analysis, we add them to the listserv, and anybody can send out to the group like periods. You just send the link to the pitch track period that you're questioning. And you're like, hey, I scored it this way, but, can you guys take a look? This is a weird one. Or like, hey, here's a good example of this year's humpback song, that kind of a thing. So we're trying to kind of crowdsource some good examples and also some, feedback on complicated.
We're an extremely nerdy little community.
Oh, yeah. So, okay, so say whales, same thing, we have our quick guide here, you read it the same way. So if we're detected, yes, we need classifications. For say whales, we look for those very characteristic doublets. Sometimes they'll do triplets or quadruplets, I don't know if it's like double, but, and then context, you do want to be aware if there's a humpback around and singing to exercise caution. Humpbacks can create doublets, but they're usually very repetitive, and say whales are kind of like North Atlantic right whales, where they're more sporadic. They're going to just kind of pop up randomly. They can also produce single down sweeps, which we have, like, there's a case where if we have at least 3 classified single down sweeps, you can say detected. There is a little bit of caution there because our colleagues up in Canada have identified that the blue whales create a very similar single down sweep. So a lot of our platforms, it's much more likely that it's going to be a say whale given the location, but it is good to know that blue whales can do a very similar call. But we don't think that they do doublets, so that's good for now. So if there's at least 3 classified, 3 classified singles, you can say detected for say whale, or if you have a doublet or a triplet and at least 1 down sweep within that is classified, you can say detected. Possibly detected, again, if it might just be sporadic calling. If there's humpback there, be careful. And you can say possibly detected if you have 1 or 2 classified singles, or sometimes there are unclassified doublets. But usually those are fairly obvious. That can be where, as Mark said, the analyst intuition can come into play, because there's times when there's a beautiful loud say whale doublet, and maybe it was so loud that the pitch tracks were just nice and long, and the classifier slightly missed it, like their Mahalanobis distance might have just been slightly higher than 3. And so in that case, if there's no humpbacks around, nothing like that, I would just score it as detected, and I would just leave a note that I went against protocol, but that they were isolated and loud.
Gabby just said that blue whale doublets look much different than say whale ones.
Oh, thank you, Gabby.
We're safe for now.
Good.
Oh, thank God.
Okay. Hopefully they don't take any notes from the say whales. So again, say whales, very low frequency. They're in the kind of 80 to 30 hertz range. They have a nice smooth down sweep. They are the ones where call type 17, there'll be some crossover. That's the old humpback call type. So sometimes they'll get classified as call type 17, which we can kind of consider as say whale depending on the context. So here's a nice detected example. Also, I forgot to explain the gray boxes. You might have seen this as we were scrolling through the pitch track data, especially with gliders. You might see a lot of gray boxes at the beginning of a pitch track period or at the end. And that's essentially just like an artifact where it overlaps with the previous pitch track period or the next pitch track period. So for our analysis protocol, we basically just ignore what's in the gray box, because we've either already scored it in the previous one, or we're going to score that information in the next one. So it's just, you're gonna see that identical information in a different period. So this is a nice example. nice loud say whale doublet, the 2 classifications. If only one of these was classified, we would still score it as detected. Honestly, if neither of them were classified, I would probably still score it as detected. But yeah, there's a nice triplet, double classification there. So detected for that. We also have some extra evidence down here, another double classified doublet. So that period would definitely be scored as detected. For possibly detected, here's call type 17 example. So we have a little bit fainter, so taking our 4 main criteria, we have a little bit fainter amplitude, good isolation, not a lot of other spurious little pitch tracks or humpback song around. The shape is pretty good, it's a pretty smooth down sweep, and then it is classified as, it's humpback, but we know there's crossover, so we would consider that a classified singlet. Here's probably an unclassified singlet, pretty good shape, a little bit short, but and pretty faint. This one is much nicer, call type 17 classification, isolated from noise. So for this one, we would consider this technically possibly detected, because for detected we would need at least 3 classified singlets. In this case, we only have 2 classifications that we're counting, and then we have a probable 3rd unclassified. All right. Also possibly detected if we only had 1 classified singlet that doesn't meet our criteria, we would need at least 3 classified to say detected. Same thing here, although this one's quite nice and loud. If we only have 1, we remain conservative for that one.
Because it could be a blue whale.
It could be blue whale. Okay. Fin whales. So for fin whales, the classifier is, I would say, very dependable. It's really well trained on those 20 hertz pulses. And so yes, we definitely rely on classifications for fin whales. For pattern, you want to look for the repeated intervals, so they're going to be very regular. Like if you just see a bunch of random pulses, it could be multiple fin whales pulsing at the same time, but a lot of times it could also just be noise that maybe happen to be at 20 hertz, so you want to be watchful of that. But they will often correspond with the seasonal internote interval. So to say detected, we need at least 4 consecutively classified fin whale pulses that match the seasonal internote intervals. And so we've cited the Morano et al. Paper from 2012 here, which shows you the seasonal internote interval. This is just for the, I think the Western North Atlantic population. Yeah.
Do they go high, low, high?
High, low.
I don't know, in the Pacific Northwest, they do go high, like high frequency note, low frequency note.
There are
The like backbeat
I
kind
mean,
of thing.
Yeah.
high,
But
We don't
not-
see that
it's
in
not really
the
high, but it's just
Western North Atlantic, do we?
I don't
I
see
think
it.
sometimes,
You see it
but
in
not
Cal,
on
much
the
in our
like
track.
off
yeah.
the West Coast.
because on the West Coast, yeah, they have like
Yeah,
2,
they're weird.
2 notes.
Yeah.
They do,
Um,
but we do, and sometimes it looks kind of like a rainbow. Like, so sometimes they do oscillate a little bit in frequency, like in the southern New England area.
They do
So it's
that,
cool.
that thing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
it's
wonder, because we see a lot of random low
Yeah.
frequency down sweeps that we haven't been able, like, we don't know what it is. I see that a lot in our archival data, so I don't really know if that, like, who knows.
we
but
haven't dived into it, I would say. But yeah,
But we
there
don't see
is
that
some
often.
variation.
We don't see like a
No.
40 hertz note
Yeah.
that's
No,
associated
that's
with
usually-
20
yeah.
hertz.
There's a
They
paper that
pulse,
just
it's
came
still
out.
But that's the
around-
case in the
it's
West
still around
Coast.
20 hertz, but it's just not the same.
Oh, offset a little bit?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
there is some offset. I don't think we've looked at it enough to actually say like how often, but I have seen variation at times.
in the real-time data, I don't
Well, you
don't see
can't.
that hardly at all. Like, I don't
But
see.
you wouldn't. In
You
the-
might not see it because
Yeah.
the resolution of those spectrograms, 20 hertz, those 20 hertz pulses are not resolved very well, to be quite honest.
But you think that at some point, like, the pattern would be, like, there would be some kind of, like, a noticeable, even if it wasn't
I don't-
classified as something, but
If the change, like I
are they
think the
random?
frequency resolution is 3 hertz, right? And if that variation is like,
Yeah,
2 to 3 hertz, you might not be able to pick that out by
It's
eye at
around
all.
It's around 3 hertz variation.
Yeah.
Over.
You might not be
I've
able to
only
pick that
No,
out.
I'm
noticed it
just
when
saying,
we
like,
go
just
into the low
the
frequency,
spacing
when
of,
we
like,
do
a
the
noise.
Oh, I
128
see.
resample
Yeah.
rate.
Yeah.
You can see it a little bit better because you can see the full pulse, like the span of it, and then, so you do see more variation.
That's true.
in
When
that,
we
but
get
I
loud
don't think we
pulses,
would
that's
see
all
it
you see.
in that
Is
number.
20
Right,
hertz,
like,
20
it's
hertz,
just a
20
very
hertz. You don't
clean-
I don't
see
think we would
anything
ever
else
see
around
that.
it.
Yeah.
It's just a very clean pulse train, usually, at least. Yeah. But yeah, so we generally follow this. So in the summer months, they're usually longer. So right now they're at about 15 to 16 seconds apart. There are some transitional periods. So like summer into fall, you might see some alternation or some kind of intermediate. Like I've seen kind of 10 to 12 second intervals. So you might see some variation during that time, and then in the fall to winter months, you're going to see usually 8 to 9 seconds. There are cases where they don't follow this, but this is pretty reliable for our region at least. So for fin whales detected, this is a really nice example. They're just there. There's no noise around. They're beautiful. They're loud. They're all classified, or most of them are. Like that for whatever reason. The Hall Novus distance might have been just slightly higher, but you can see it within the context that it's very obvious fin whale. For possibly detected, so for detected, you need at least 4 in a row that are classified. For possibly detected, you need at least 3 what you think are pulses with at least 2 classified to say possibly detected. So down here, this would be, is that right? Yeah, 3, yeah, 2 must be classified. Yeah, so I think down here, we have, if we zoom in, we have maybe some, the INIs, like the intervals are already a little off here. Like they're wild animals, they're not always going to be perfect, but if you only have a few to go off of and they're already inconsistent, that's kind of a red flag. You just might not have enough information to go off of. So this would be a possibly detected case because we only have a few that are classified and they're not super consistent with their spacing. And we have a few others like these are really tough because if they're unclassified, they could be off by like a few hertz and they just could be noise down there. That's not a real fin whale pulse. Like that looks like it's slightly lower than actually 20 hertz. So if it's not classified, it's very likely that it could also just be noise. Also, just standalone pulses are hard. It could be a faint fin whale pulse. Who knows? It could also be noise. So this one we would score as possibly detected. Same here. We have 4 possible ones in a row with 2 classified. So this is a great possibly detected example. It's just hard to say without a more full pulse train. Also, just for context here, we have some low frequency noise, just kind of random, varying amplitudes, varying shapes. So that's a red flag too, because we know there's some low frequency noise here and some other random. There could be something. This is where Mark tells us not to make up stories about the data. So if there's not a pulse there, don't say there's a pulse there, or don't try to imagine it. Yeah, don't try to talk. If you have to talk yourself into it, just take a step back and be cautious. Not detected. This is a great example of noise. These are also what we call artifacts here, these perfectly vertical straight lines. So this is just a case where the algorithm is trying to connect 2 sounds. So this is not actually, there's not actually like a straight line in the raw audio. It's very unlikely. This is probably just the algorithm connecting sounds that it thinks are associated together. So those we often, if they're blue, like we typically say, approach those with caution. A lot of the time they're noise if they're within clusters like this. So that's a nope. And then again here already we see some noise. It's eye-catching. This is where in our 2-day training we see some examples like this where people want to say it's detected, but without the classification. Like these could be, 30 hertz and we wouldn't know just by eyeballing it. So we would say not detected here. You could always put a note, but we would not classify that as anything. Okay, humpback, yay. These are fun. So humpbacks, for the quick guide here, yes or no for classification. You really don't need we don't rely on classifications for humpbacks very much. You're much more reliant on whether there's a pattern or not for the calls. Context, you might consider noise, but also, but if they're there, often they're fairly obvious. We've created the protocol where you need at least 5 calls within a 15-minute period, some of which, like at least some of them need to be in pattern for you to say detected for humpback, possibly detected. You want some repetition there, but if you have fewer than 5 calls, typically we just downgrade it to possibly detected, because oftentimes you might not be able to see enough of a pattern to really make sure that it's humpback. So even if you have like one down sweep, and often they'll create higher frequency, this is all very low frequency, but above like 300 or 400 hertz. If you see biological looking calls up in that range, you might say possibly detected for humpback. So some examples here. So this is a detected example for humpback. You can see there's some artifacts that are these straight up and down, these vertical lines. But you also see some nice defined calls in the red here. So these help us, they're in a very clear pattern. And this one got classified as a right whale, but this is where we use our human eyeball and brain, and we say, okay, this is in a very clear pattern. It's very unlikely that that's going to be right whale. Down here, we see that pattern continued. There's some higher frequency calls as well, which is always really nice to see. That's definitely indicative of a humpback. So a lot of artifacts, but you can also see a lot of defined calls here as well. So this is definitely enough pattern. We have more than 5 calls here. You could say detected for humpback in this case. Scrolling down, this is another detected case. So we have a few calls here in pattern. Not amazing quality as far as pitch tracks. Like here we have a couple of artifacts that are joining these sounds together. Could be because it's just a fainter down sweep, but we have that. And then I think there's a few calls down here. So this might be kind of a scream and then 2 down sweeps. So we have enough here. We have more than 5 calls that are in pattern. They don't all have to be in pattern together, those 5 calls, but within a 15-minute period, at least a few clusters of pattern vocalizations, we can say detected for humpback. Down here, you can see more artifacts labeled here. This is we would say a possibly detected or borderline, maybe even not detected period for humpback. This is going off of kind of a pattern. Sometimes they'll like have ascending calls up into song or descending calls. And so if you've seen other similar humpback, you might see this and be like, oh, maybe it's a faint humpback. I would definitely not score this as detected. I would save this as either possibly or not detected. Blue flag, but they're faint. They're dark blue and light blue, most of this, so it's also a bit difficult to tell if this is noise or biological. So you could also score as not detected and put in a note. Here, there's an artifact, which is just another, like, maybe that could be noise. It's hard to tell. It's something to take into consideration for context. But then we do see a lower frequency possible pattern there, but faint. There's not really like 5 clear biological calls in pattern, so we would say possibly detected. Not detected, noise, faint, no real pattern, a lot of artifacts, and some other noise in the, like low frequency noise and stuff, which is good to take into account.
Okay.
So that would be not detected. I always forget about this section, and so it would be nice to go first. The structure of a humpback song, if you're unfamiliar, is structured similarly to human songs. So they have notes or units. So a single unit they'll put different notes or units together to create a phrase here. So we see them assembling the phrases, and then they put the phrases together into themes. So and they'll sing for hours, and often you'll hit your data limit pretty quickly, which is a little frustrating because they're there. And they'll transition between themes as well, so you'll see like theme 1 into theme 2 here.